this evening. I mean, for the better part of the past decade, most of the past decade, Budget Day in South Africa has always come with much dread. And we've basically waited for this February date and expected the worst bit of news about everything about this country, the fiscus, our economic prospects. I mean, we've had ministers in the past that have promised that everything will be all right. I remember that. But the numbers never quite backed his assertion. I think the very brief stint, if I would go back to Nhlatanene as finance minister, was the last time we had a budget with some sunnier disposition to it. Today's budget was nowhere near as sunny, but Finance Minister Tito Mboweni delivered in a COVID-19 year a surprisingly upbeat budget. I'm going to hold on to that. I mean, the possible return of a commodity cycle has come to save the day after a year that was laid ruined by the pandemic. Joining me to discuss Finance Minister Tito Mboweni's budget without any plants or fruits as the centerpiece, as regular contributors to Fin24, and that's Zamandlo, Fin24 columnist, Nolwandle Mthombeni, analyst at Intellidex, and Swiss Kenjani, chief economist at IQ Business. Good evening, and thank you all for joining us this evening. Hi,
good to be here.
Good. Let me start off by giving you all a chance to share your initial take on the budget. Zama, I'll give you a chance to go first. Just your thoughts on today's in Parliament in Pretoria.
I think as a citizen, I felt a little bit of relief. I was expecting another one of those budgets where consumers have to pay some kind of tax in order to cover some kind of deficit, particularly with COVID-19 and some talk around how do we pay for the vaccines. So to get the tiniest bit of relief for me was a highlight in what has been really kind of the worst year since democracy in terms of the budget and just everything around our social economics. So that was a relief. There are some gaps I still think as to where exactly some of that investment is going. That's going to get us some bang that will help us grow faster. But I think that's almost for next year's budget. Right now, I'm just totally relieved.
No, Andre, your initial take just of today's budget?
I think for me, the biggest highlight was the power of kitchen sinking, which is basically what he did in the MTBS. He basically set expectations to be so dim that, he became as a star today. If you think about it, when we came from the ATBS, we heard the number 100%, in terms of the debt ratio to GDP. I mean, that was the expectation set by then. And at that point, obviously, all the rating agencies were, giving us an X, ready to downgrade us. They literally had their finger on the downgrade button, and everything seemed really bleak. And also what happened is that, over the last couple of months, we've had expectations around this is going to be rate increase on this and that, so I really think that if he hadn't been so dim and, set really tough expectations in the MTBS, he wouldn't have, had a much better story to tell now, which is ultimately what happened, because there were a lot of surprises to the upside coming from, the expectations that we had coming from MTBS.
That's pretty smart. Like when a new CEO comes into a company, he always blames all the ugly stuff from the past CEO. But hey, this is how bad it is. So the next reporting period, any upside is like put on him immediately, right? Pretty smart, actually. I never thought of that. Sviso, Skenjana, your thoughts on today's budget?
So I probably am not as, energized as most people. And I think for me, the sentiment is really anchored around the reform conversation, right? In general, if you just think simply, we can take anything. If you are trying to get investment into your house, you need to have a very strong balance sheet and income statement. And a lot of what's come out around the budget has not been around capacity building in building in financial sustainability of government functions, right? We continue to have these reports coming out of the Auditor General around, the I guess, missteps that are happening from an expenditure point of view, whether it's fruitless and wasteful expenditure, as well as also just a misappropriation of funds in the way in which it doesn't solve the development agenda. And for me, there certainly hasn't been still a conversation coming through around what is the capacity building program to ensure that we actually finally clean up our balance sheet as a country. That's the first thing. The other thing is that there's something that we're missing, or maybe we're not paying enough attention to. So particularly with respect to the renewables. The renewables now, if you look at the government's contingent liabilities, and so that's call it the propensity for the government to potentially have to step in the event that there's default from an ESCOM point of view, is called the RPA, which is the repurchase agreements. Those are now making up about 15% of our contingent liabilities, and ESCOM, outside of the alternatives, is also making up the bulk of those contingent liabilities. What that means is that when we're going into bid window 5 and we're still procuring energy from the alternative guys at above average cost, localized cost of energy, the LCOE from ESCOM, we are purchasing electricity from these renewables at a higher average cost. Yes, the marginal cost is going down, but we're still purchasing at a higher average cost. Bid window 5 is going to result in higher RPAs, and so higher contingent liabilities on the back of these repurchase agreements that government is in essence guaranteeing, and that's certainly going to weaken our balance sheet. And so when I look at what Minister Mboweni said, is that our budget deficit is expected to be lower than the 300 million that we expected, and we're looking about 213 million to come through now. And I'm saying, well, where's the capacity going to come from? Corporate income tax 12 years ago was contributing 27% to the revenue basket. It's now contributing 15.9%, which means we've lost a lot of capacity at an organizational level. And these are all the things for me that should be the capacity focus points around turning around the quality of our financial framework as a country, to eventually, of course, put us in a position where we can invest sustainably, as well as fund all of the development projects that can improve the state of the South African citizen.
So just taking your outlook there, rather bleak outlook, I'm going to pass it back to Nandla. So is this basically a reprieve, or this budget intrudes like a reprieve given the higher commodity prices that just come to kind of lessen, I guess, change the sentiment slightly, but we still are pretty much in the same situation we're in October, or basically we're in the same position?
So, I mean, the good thing is that we are not going to, as consumers, going to, take the brunt of the burden of what's happening in terms of our fiscus. And ultimately, what the minister does is just gives projections of what he thinks, the government thinks things are going to play out. But unfortunately, it's all about the how and the execution of it. All those, those expectations and forecasts around revenue growth and, achieving that lower deficit, it's all about how government intervenes to ensure that, there's execution. Suze was right, is that, in terms of renewable energy, I mean, that, even that, it's been a slog for a very long time. And another thing is, the 340 billion project pipeline. What we should have heard at SONA is, the deployment of that, but we haven't heard that. So I think, it's good to hear that, we've got some relief in terms of, from the tax point of view, where consumers haven't had to, pay more tax, and we're not funding, more debt. I think ultimately now is that to make it more credible and believable that, in 2025, we're going to have have the deficit come down to 0.8%. What is the path to that? And I think that's the problem, is that the path is still not clear about how we do this. And it speaks to, creating that capacity in the system. Even from the SONA, we didn't get the sense that, we're creating that capacity. And, if we can't create that capacity, we can't really get through on policy implementation, then we're going to have to be here, we're going to be where we were in the MTBS, maybe, in 6 months from now.
Zama, speaking to those capacity constraints, just how does Africa overcome these constraints, which I guess have maybe it's been decades long. We've had these constraints, we've never actually dealt with them.
I think for me, when we say capacity constraints, we often it's euphemism for how do you get different results from a declining public service. If you look at the typical public servant of 10 years ago who was in government to the typical public servant that is in government now, we've had a public brain drain that is immeasurable, but we see it in when you propose a policy and there's inaction. And part of it is political will, but a very much bigger part of it is technical capacity. One thing I was excited about in this budget was the zero-based budgeting, and that there'll be a framework for that. As somebody who's worked in the public service, I've seen how there's a momentum that comes with how budgeting is done in every department, where you simply take whatever figure you have and the same programs that you have, and you just apply inflation or whatever adjustment Treasury gives to you, and that's the new budget. And your narrative for your votes read the same. It's actually the funniest thing to go and read some of the votes year on year and see that the changes are just figures and years, but the programs are still the same. That's going to put some discipline, hopefully, into the system where people have to justify the impact of previous programs, whereas before you only had to justify new programs. That's going to help. But if we don't have some kind of direction around real capacitation of the state, a real transformation of the state in the sense of how do we make sure that we do something about the dead wood in public service at the moment? How do we attract talent back? Because you can have all the budget in the world, but its impact is so largely dependent on the quality of the public servant.
It's almost like in this discussion, we like focusing on the implementation, and key to that being people. But so I'll go to, this is about, as Zama said, attracting the right people back into public service who were once there. But given that public sector wages is such a thing, and how basically public sector wages is where it is, right, mismanaged over the past 10 odd years, how does the state then begin to capacitate itself? Well, it does start with HR, human resources.
Yeah, I think one of the conversations that really do entertain me a lot is the conversation around the public sector wage bill.
Yeah.
And there are a number of reasons. But yeah. I want to quickly first just respond to also the point that Nolandi made around particularly the infrastructure component, is that we talk about a pipeline of 380 odd infrastructure projects, but you'll go and talk to any of the large banks as well as the development agencies in the country, IDC, New Development Bank, they'll tell you that funding is not the issue. The issue is project preparation. And so unless we understand the real impediment towards true infrastructure delivery, we're not going to get to where we need to get to. And so unless we take the projects from where they are, we clean them up and make them bankable, where then private sector can participate, we're not going to truly realize the dividend that can come from infrastructure as an investment, as well as a growth enabler from our country. And I think for me, I don't hear enough coming out around what it means to transform infrastructure from where it was to where it should be, and truly enable it to become transformative in the way we envisage it. Then the conversation around specifically the public sector wage bill, I think it's so easy for us to get pulled into narratives around the public sector wage bill without getting into the detail. First and foremost, the public sector wage bill started accelerating post-financial crisis, which was about 2008, early 2009. And that was government's initiative towards spurring some economic activity and economic participation. And what they did is that they invested then in the extended public works programs. The mistake that they made is that they didn't link that into the private sector from an absorption point of view. And so these then became, again, what we're seeing in today's context, job opportunities that didn't materialize into permanent job realities for most people. And government couldn't or didn't end up laying off everyone who had gone through those programs. And if you also look, then what happens is, where's the employment actually taken place? It's actually been in healthcare, it's been in education, and in police. That's the bulk of where government has employed over the last 12 years. And also, when we look at the numbers, so people keep talking about the 7.3 growth rate of the public sector wage bill, which is above inflation, and no one is actually looking and saying, is the growth in individual salaries, or is the growth in how much government is paying in general to public sectors? So when government is employing more people, the amount of money they pay to as a wage bill grows. And that 7.3 is actually about how much they paid in total between then and now, and not the actual average annual increases of individuals, which was actually between 1.5 and 2.3%. And so when you're actually looking at public sector wage participants, they haven't realized a 7.3% increase in their wages over the period. And it's critical for us to look at that as all of that conversation in context. And the last thing that's quite critical here is that we look at the public sector wage bill as a percentage of GDP. And if you've got capacity that's leaving the economy in whichever format, and as I made example around how much we're collecting from CIT as compared to what we're collecting 10 years ago, the denominator is decreasing, but government is sparing employment on the top end. And so what it starts to look like, it starts to look disproportionate when we're actually not looking at also and saying, can we walk and chew at the same time? Can we optimize our public service as well as build capacity into the economy to ensure that we don't have another 10 years of jobless growth? So post the financial crisis, we did see the economy turn around from an output point of view. We saw wages not pick up at the same rate and employment not pick up at the same rate. And exactly the same thing we saw with the employment numbers that came out yesterday, is that the people who were initially the 2.2 million people who came out in the previous quarter, third quarter, impacted by COVID, when they came back into job seek, they didn't get into employment, into full employment, as we would have expected the rebound to be. And so most of consensus was expecting the employment numbers to look better than they actually came. And so the point is that when we talk about public sector wage bill, there's so much texture into that conversation, is that we need to have it in context so that the conversation we're having is a fuller conversation, instead of saying that government is financially irresponsible and they're employing all of these people who are dead weight for the economy and government needs to just lay them off.
Yeah, it's only 190,000 additional public service employers since 2008, right? So everyone was talking about these huge numbers of how many new public employees have come into the stream. It's only 190,000. No, I've listed quite a few questions here where we go about today's budget, but I think the start of this budget is quite depressing. We just get us back in context. Where do we, how do we take this relief and hope that going into next year, we're not back at last year's budget? How do we move forward from here? So just giving what how Sfiso has outlaid the problems.
So I think, one big underlying narrative is that, government wants the people to go and spend. It's quite important. I think, what SARS has done a good job of, our SARS Kieswetter, SARS Kieswetter, Mr. Kieswetter has done, I think he's done a good job of cleaning up what's happening there. And I think the revenue collection abilities have been enhanced. So, and even so, there was additional money being allocated to SARS, which is very necessary. So I think, get the public to spend, because now you provide the relief. You might tax them on the alcohol, the booze, the whatever, the road agency fund, whatever it is. But, to create an environment where people can start, allowing to generate more revenue. So, and this is simple as the fact that if we get that vaccine roll coming through, because the first thing you need to address is obviously, there's negative sentiments and fear around people around COVID. You're not going to get the kind of, revenue projections, why people are still feeling the need to, stuck at home and they've got the fear and they're not going to go out and spend. Because ultimately, they didn't just cut, increase the tax bracket by 5% just for fun. I think with that, it's to incentivize some of the behavior, even the corporate cutting of taxes from 28 to 27. It has to do with incentivizing corporates, to create that wealth environment where they can, operate and invest in the company and in the country. So those are kind of key things that need to be a driver to get any sort of revenue. And this is all about the top line that I'm speaking to, because ultimately the top line will feed into your expenditure and paying off your interest costs. So, if we do the vaccine right and we can get it there, it's the first step to helping us reinvigorate the economy, which is ultimately what will help us to deliver and get to those, blue sky that we projected out into 2025.
Zama, I read your column this week, and the finance minister has been low to ever describe his budgets as one of austerity, and he always takes the opportunity to take a pot shot of those who call it so. What does he say? He says, no, it's not an austerity budget, it's one that faces the harsh realities. But to stir growth in the South African economy, what should be done? With regards to should the taps be opened up and more spend? Just your view on just what would it take to spur growth from a fiscal response?
There are limits to how much government spending you can have that leads to economic growth. As I think it was Governor Kanyaho who explained in a press briefing after the budget that you get crowding out at a certain point, and then you don't have productive investment from the private sector happening, which is the kind of investment you need to get the economy growing. And so for me, I think, and this is what I was highlighting in my column today, is that it's so important that government spending is focused on the right programs that complement but do not crowd out private sector investment. And that's what we need to see. I think for the idea around austerity is an idea that we are decreasing our spending, our real spending. And there are social spaces in social spending where we are actually not maybe increasing spending as much as we should, but you need to earn that budget to be able to spend on social programs. And we just haven't been growing fast enough to be able to see the kind of large increases in social spending that we were seeing in the years leading up to 2007. And I think in the system, we were so accustomed to that large increase that we look at the absence of those increases in social spending outside of the context of the fact that after 2010, we've really been declining progressively almost every year in GDP growth. So we need to start focusing, which is something that we haven't done in a long time in South Africa, really start focusing on spending on the value creating programs, the right infrastructure, get a bang out of our infrastructure spending in particular, in order to be able to support growth and to not have a government, social spending in terms of social relief of immediate shocks such as the COVID-19 pandemic are really important, but they are not sustainable over a long period of time. You need people to actually get into real jobs. You need an economy to actually be growing. And that means a real balance between social spend and investment spend and productive spend. And that's the balance that we need to find now.
So I guess in terms of the spend, for what someone alerts to, is this quality spend, right, being important. And for that to be quality spend, I guess it all goes again to your issue of capacity, whether it's in municipalities, and that's actually where the rubber hits the road. What's your take on just how do we spur this economic growth, the austerity versus growth arguments?
if you look at National Treasury's position, they say that broadly speaking, that they're counter-cyclical in their policy approach, and that by design, what it means is that when you are broadly in a contracting environment, they ought to spend into the cycle or invest into the cycle to spur growth. And there's plenty of empirical evidence that shows, of course, that when you go into austerity in a contraction, it results in negative outcomes, particularly in the medium to long term. And so that's why the counter-cyclical approach actually becomes quite productive. And now the question is the money being spent productively? And I think that's an important question. I think one of the things that I do take a little bit of reservation around is the fact that we're creating a nanny state out of South Africa, particularly looking at the role of all of the social support in driving productive outcomes. There was a 2003 Taylor Committee that looked at the value of social programs and social spending in South Africa. And one of the things that came out is that firstly, a universal basic income grant did drive higher productivity levels, particularly at a manufacturing level. And we've seen how manufacturing, their productivity has declined over the last 15 years or so. It also spoke about the role of a universal basic income grant in reducing poverty incidence. And it does so because poverty in itself expresses itself in what we call multidimensional poverty, which is through nutrition, through social capital, through education, as well as through healthcare and educational outcomes. And so what it does is that often is that people are more productive when they're at school because they've had something to eat. People are less prone to nutritional deficits, and so there's less pressure on the health system. And people are, of course, able to job seek. In the context of our economy, we found that people who are more long-term unemployed tend to stay long-term unemployed because of the cost of job seek in South Africa. And so social programs and social development programs are critical in even driving labor participation in South Africa, over and above us talking about people have babies so that they can get a grant. But until you build social resilience, you are not going to be able to increase and improve your human capital development index. And you're not going to get long-term aggregate growth if your human capital is not improving. And so what we're seeing in South Africa is that right now, from the tax collection point of view, but financial services contributing 41% to revenue as per December 2020 tax statistics. And that's a sector that's only, 18 or 17% big, right? But it's contributing 41% of the revenue. And to even give you the extent of the industry concentration in South Africa, 380 companies were attributable to about 57% of the taxes collected. And these are companies earning taxes, with taxable income in excess of 200 million odd. What that means specifically in the context of this conversation is that our failure to build in that industry capacity starts to force us to look at the wrong thing as the thing that's slowing us from growing. We're looking at social spending as the thing that's an impediment for our development, when it's actually something that actually should drive our development because of all of the empirics that are there that show that when your human capital development index improves, it actually results in higher what we call total factor productivity. It results in higher GERD, which is research and innovation and development. And these are all the things that are grounded by, for example, what Paul Romer was talking about in the endogenous growth theory prior to him winning the Nobel Peace Award around that. And so for me, when we think about social spending, it certainly is not an impediment to sustainable development, but one of the things we've failed to do is understand the key states of the country or key states of the economy that should be enablers for the development of industry. And so, for example, I said that the biggest risk item in our economy is municipalities. And until we get them financially sustainable, we will not get the right kind of road infrastructure investment, the kind of telecom infrastructure investment, water, and all of these things that are enablers for agriculture, enablers for transport and logistics, enablers for many other sectors. And so I talk about municipalities as being a network industry. And until we deal with that network industry in its inability to play the network role, we're going to continue focusing on development spending as an impediment for our growth. And just like we've heard before, the country must grow first before we earn our right to develop the people. And I don't subscribe to that thinking at all.
I know that when I just hear municipalities, I think I drove through a Tankos standard in Mpumalanga recently, and when you see that municipality, then you realize the depth of the problems in this country. But I'm sorry I bring that, but our politics, how much does it allow us to actually go deeper and actually deal with fundamentally? And I think I'm in agreement with Spuso here that we have an issue with regards just to municipalities. That's low. How do we start to deal with that given the politics of our country? I'm not asking you to like overtly talk about just the central players, but South African politics, we had a bad brand of politics for a long time. Where do we start reforming that if we're actually going to deal with the issue at our municipalities?
So just to sidetrack a bit, whenever I think of municipalities, I think of that ESCOM bill that's being owed by so many of them. That's the first thing that comes to mind, and I'm just like, they need to pay back the money. But I think if you look at our history, I mean, we are unfortunately, everything that happens from a government perspective is tied to the unions, and for a long time that's been the push and pull for everything. When we talk about every kind of policy, labor has been so dominant in how everything was founded on terms about democracy, where organized labor is very important into getting people to get fair increases. Organized labor was key to that, and it was also seen as necessary to kind of get some sort of redistribution of growth into to the impoverished individuals of society. So I think, the biggest obstacle is, trying to not be bullied by the labor and unions. And that's the biggest obstacle from, policies around, from, for example, mining, obviously, that could have been a booming sector, but, the relationship between the labor unions and the corporates, become very messy. And so there's many sparks of growth that we could have had in our economy where those relationships didn't work out. And now, finally government has to sort of take a stand. And even, we have pension reform, that should have gone through a couple of years ago, but it didn't because, they were challenged on that. But we know that, it's very necessary if you think about long term and, having people have that pension reform there. So I think if they can actually get to a place where, I know we talk about social compact, and will there ever be a social compact? We don't know. We don't know. But I think it is a starting point. And I think, if we can just at least agree on a few policies related things and get, them pushed through important regulations and, because everything starts with what will the union say. And it also distracts government of what they're supposed to do. Because now, everything you have there, it's going to be a big fight first and big flog. And at the same time, there's some looting happening in the background, So I think that's kind of key challenge that we have to kind of deal with because it's been dragging us for how many years of democracy have we had? That long. 20,
we have so long. Zama, our brand of politics and the trade-offs that have to be made that almost, I guess, make it difficult to reform even at municipal level. Just your thoughts on just our brand of politics.
Oh, I was hoping you'd give me a different question. I really. So there's something that the minister said in his speech about the importance of community ownership of assets, and I just started thinking that there is so much to a community feeling like it owns the assets, and that's part of the politics and part of the broken politics at municipal levels. If you look at the share of the budget that went into municipalities or local government, it's quite low. Yet, as you said earlier, it's where the rubber hits the road. And in order for a country to have impact, the relationship between the implementer and the communities is so important. But without that healthy politics and healthy processes of decision making that include the communities, you're not going to have a feeling of ownership in communities on the assets that are there, because they don't know why was the clinic chosen over something else, and it's also a contestation of many other things that are happening. So I was a little bit hopeful initially around some of the reforms that are around electing direct representation at national level. But I started thinking to myself, actually, we have a little bit of that at local government and it's not working. Mm. And I don't have answers. I think that politics or politicians or political parties have so much say that the rise of independence we're not seeing the rise of independence. We're seeing independents who get a fair share of votes at local level are independents that come out of political parties. So they're recognized already because of a political party framework. Yeah. We've been looking at this project around how do we support independent candidates in some of these municipalities, and even us, we're getting a little despondent around, is it possible? Because actually communities are used to voting for political parties. So a lot needs to be done in separating the party from the person. And I have no idea how it can be done at the moment, but I do know that when it is done, we might start to see a lot more of that connection between community assets and public representative. But we have to figure out how. So if anyone has any ideas, they must just email me, because that's what we're looking for at the moment.
Yeah, I think we sat here on this one lever of state, right, municipality, and I thought about the SOEs, right? This is the first budget in a long time, in forever, where I haven't heard where SAA, ESCOM hasn't dominated the headline, have played no starring role in this budget at all, thankfully. But is this all just a reprieve because of COVID-19? Is what's happening in municipalities still rather endemic in just the operations of SOEs? No matter the board changes that we've seen, the new CEOs and the like that we've seen over the past 3 years, but I'm almost seeing a similarity here in zmunicipalities and how they are run with SOEs below the ground, no matter the changes on top. So are we out of the hole when it comes to SOEs, Zam? I'll let you continue with that. Just pretty much your views on our SOEs, and will return to another budget in a year or two to come to haunt us.
Oh, this should have been for Sfiso or someone, but I think they're gonna come back. I think there's an intrinsic relationship between the health of municipalities and the health of ESCOM in particular. And so if you don't have financially sustainable municipalities, you will not have a financially sustainable ESCOM. If you do not have municipalities that are decisive about collecting rates and taxes, you're not going to have sustainable SOEs, not just in electricity, but also in water and other services. And so it, in many ways, although we are getting these way above inflation increases in energy costs, we are also which is something that I think wasn't touched on enough in the budget, we're also seeing a lot of people we're seeing a lower contribution of people, or a lower number of people contributing to the income tax base. And so we have that problem of you cannot keep increasing and increasing and increasing the cost of services on already strained citizens. You have to really address the financial sustainability of municipalities, and again there's certain parts of and it's not all Tito Mboweni's role, but there are big gaps in how we change the way things have been going, how the bang for the buck for strategic institutions, spheres of government. There are big gaps in that actually mean that we are not sure whether or not we're out of this hole or this is just a breather. We're in an eye of a storm and the storm is coming in 6 months.
So regards, Zama said I should throw it to you, SOE reform and just your take on them going forward.
So thanks, Zama, for throwing me under the bus there. I think, the points Zama is making are spot on, right? And so if you look at the revenue mix of most municipalities, a lot of them generate a bulk of their revenue from electricity sales. And so they're buying electricity at 90 cents or whatever per kilowatt hour at Eskom, and they're selling it somewhere between R1.70 to R2 per kilowatt hour, which is interestingly equivalent to what we are purchasing alternative energy at right now, the 6,000 megawatts. And so the first challenge there is that as there's a move towards self-generation, particularly by the high energy users, so mines now are looking at opportunities to invest in solar, etc., as well as to invest in water assets. What happens to the financial sustainability of those municipalities who rely primarily either on municipal infrastructure grants as well as the revenue margins that they're making on electricity sales? And so this is why initially I said that the financial capacity building programs for local government is probably going to be the key enabler for transformative growth for the country. We've got some municipalities who don't even generate any revenue and they literally live on grants. Those are businesses and we've got to make them financially sustainable. And so the critical part here is that we're not looking at the electricity risk as an earnings risk for municipalities as well as a financial sustainability risk. And that's the one thing that we're looking at. The second thing, which I think is going to be quite critical in terms of how SOEs and how the capacity conversation goes for SOEs, is again the point Zama made is around what are strategic assets and what are not. And for a while, I'll acknowledge it and I'll own it. I used to say SAA was a strategic asset, and my basis was that private sector doesn't always play ball, and sometimes they really play hard ball with public sector. And if you privatize your airspace, you literally can declare South Africa a no-fly zone, and that can have critical implications for the economy, and therefore that can be used as a bullying lever by private sector. And so I used to think SAA was a critical or strategic asset for the country. And then there was a question that I got challenged and said, maybe AXA is the real asset. If you just look at how Dubai and Qatar have grown, it's not through Qatar Airways, it's not through Emirates, it's actually around leveraging the networks and using that as a flying hub for connectivity into the other countries, etc. And that's what is working quite well in the East African community context as well. And so I think AXA right now, for example, was the only SOE that had gone, I think over a 20-year period, had only had 1 year of financial loss prior to the COVID impact. And you can see what they're doing already. They're rationalizing their business. They're selling non-core assets. And it seems like that's literally the most sober SOE in our country. And maybe that's really where we should be investing more around, saying, actually, this idea of South Africa truly being the arrowhead into the continent maybe is through AXA. And then we pump that and make sure also we decentralize or we centralized rather the routing, because what we did, and it resulted in a lot of revenue losses, that when we made direct flights available for Cape Town, is that AXA started losing revenues and tourism started losing revenues in Johannesburg for connecting flights. And so we just need to be smarter probably around how we leverage a core asset like AXA and leave SA Air into a market determining space. And I think so the key around really finding strategic assets is in understanding how they can really be growth enablers for the country. In South Africa, only 12% of our population use airlines. So SAA really probably is a vanity project, and we need to get over that. But as I said, is that I'm more than willing to also, come up and say, for some time, I used to hang my head and say, maybe SAA is a strategic asset. But I think the road to sustainability from an economic point of view is truly understanding what are truly our strategic assets, how do we leverage them for growth, and how does it actually truly benefit most people in the economy. And this is the thing that we probably haven't focused on as a means of looking at SOE reform from our context as a country.
It's just your contrarian nature, mate, that you try to find a reason for SA. I think I was also there trying to find a justification, just find a story for it. I'm coming to the close of it, but clearly here in our conversation is municipalities and SOEs, which largely speaks to the capacity of the state and which will fundamentally, like in the long term, the sustainability of the South African budget, the balance sheet, our balance sheet is at risk because of these two issues. But now let's talk about the super commodity cycle, right? I'm going to start with you. Nolwandle, with regards to the super commodity cycle. For a large part, that powered our growth in those early years, those glorious Thabo Mbeki years of high growth and BE deals left, right, and center, 4 or 5 years. Should it be sustained, right? That this commodity cycle is back. As miners now, you can see them, was it this week, all of them talking about spending in capital, like reinvesting in their operations. Should it stay for another 4 years? Let's just give it a 3-4 year period. Is it enough to paper over the cracks of South Africa? And again, and is it not a bit of a fear? I think I could see by the sober nature of Mboweni's delivery that our policymakers almost get lazy by the fact that this cycle is here and its power, and it does have that stimulatory effects, in particular in the mining sector, and it knocks on to smaller towns like maybe a Rustenburg might finally get some love after all these years of pain. Just how, the super commodity cycle, will it paper over our cracks? Can it paper over these cracks we've spoken about? And just for how long can we almost live on this, on the hype of it?
So short answer is no. Yeah. Definitely not. We had a lucky boon that happened over the last couple of months. We just got lucky. It's not like we didn't do anything right. We certainly didn't do anything right. So you can't really take credit for something that you didn't get right. It was pure luck. And it's a cycle. That's the thing. It's just a cycle. See, the problem what happened is that, the mining sector stopped investing into, increasing the output many, many years ago. 2014 already, everything stopped, So as soon as you do that, that means that your life of mine becomes shorter and, you're really constrained. If we were able to, kind of ride this wave and extract lots of revenue out of it, you would have seen huge production increases over the last couple of years. But no miner has reported significant increase in production. And even now, they are not in a position to produce increased production. And they might talk about investments, but it's really in the fringes. But not only that, most of them have, moved and taken things offshore and, sold off SA assets. So the mining sector already just took, clocks out of South Africa a long time ago, and they're minimizing the level of capex spend there. And they suddenly find themselves also with a flurry of cash for the first time in 8 years, where they've got in the balance sheet now. And what their first priority is reducing debt and paying dividends. So I think, they're investing into, increasing capacity, should have been done a long time ago. And also the problem is now, if you start investing now, a year from now, the cycle will turn. Cycle will turn. But they were burned, in the previous cycle, so they're not willing to. So there's a lot of talk about maybe we started increasing, but if it was really about that, I mean, we've seen this high in mining, the commodity prices have been high for a very long time, a couple of years now, yet the production has been flat to down.
Hasn't followed suit.
Exactly. So I think, as the government also did, they just, saw this great, even the trade numbers were looking good. They have been. We benefit from it. It's happened. No one's penciling it for happen, for another year. Definitely not. And we've seen now even oil, it was down, it's back up. You cannot, forecast anything or put your hopes on commodities. Commodities are the worst, So definitely not. Definitely not.
Yes, Zama, to your point, so we're not going to have this bailout for very long when it comes to this commodity price.
No, and also we have an electricity problem. So when it comes to mining, you can't kind of be all thinking about, there's commodity boom in a country where if too much energy demand, we're back to load shedding.
Lights go out.
Lights go out. So, I mean, we don't talk enough about the fact that the economy has transformed significantly since 2006, 2007. 2008, not only because of the financial crisis, but also because of the energy crisis that we had. And that if we're looking for growth, we have to look for growth in less energy dependent sectors, or we need to get a return for the extraordinary amount of investment we've made in the energy sector. So I agree with Nolwandle. This is one of those, we've had some bad luck as South Africa in the last while, and this was some good luck. But we are not making our own luck as a country. We're not making the right investments, and we're also not spending time on regulatory issues that could enable private sector investment and other contributions. We talk about SMEs, for example, and we talk about the fact that 9 out of 10 jobs come from SMEs, and then that's it.
What do we do for them?
The end of the conversation. We don't have a plan around that. We don't talk about what kind of infrastructure do SMEs need? What kind of interventions do SMEs need? No, it's just a little one-liner and off we go. So we haven't made our own luck. We haven't had a plan, and we must see good luck when we see good luck and wish it well and do the best with what we get out of it, and then go make our actual luck.
I mean, I'm end of this conversation with Sfiso when we started this conversation, Sonkela, like Nolwandle and Zaman, we were kind of like upbeat and relief nyana from this budget, and then you came in and just hit us for a sec. So I just actually gutted us in terms of our sunnier, a more positive outlook with what the gospel was delivered today. Take us through your, I'll start with you, with just your forecast for the next few years to come, and just what do you see for the South African economy, for the fiscus? I mean, we're dealing now, I guess, with the vaccine rollout, but everyone is concentrated on, and hopefully the state can deliver on that promise of, is it 40 million people vaccinated? So what is your outlook on the South African economy, taking into all the good luck we've got now from this cycle?
So, I mean, I promise you, I try as hard as I can not to be a wet cloth for the most part. And I think the prospects for the economy is a story of mixed fortunes. I think there are sectors that have opportunity and there are other sectors that are going to be particularly constrained. I think tourism, for example, just making an example, is just going to continue taking a beating for the medium term, right? But you've got sectors like logistics, for example, where either from a cold storage point of view or from a warehousing point of view, because of the rise in e-commerce, is showing value and lots of interesting opportunities there. And so I think at an industry level, the growth story is certainly going to be a story of mixed fortunes. And we certainly need to de-risk the economy from the earnings concentration it's got from large or oligopolistic structures. And therefore, I think we need to spend a lot more time, I think Uzama alludes to it, in competition law reform. We've got challenges in South Africa around just the level of industry concentration that then elbows out the growth of small businesses and their ability to become medium-sized businesses. I think if we become smart from a government point of view, we can also leverage procurement as an enabler for driving SME development, right? And so if you just go back to the example with Clicks, I had a racist incident, and then the first thing they came back said, yeah, we're going to empower informal market participants who are in the caregiving space, either doing hair, etc. I'm saying, and I was sitting there, I was like, why has this not been happening for long enough, right? Because our informal sector tends to mirror a lot of the developed components of our sectors. And so why are we not having, for example, a ShopRite not trying to cannibalize a Spaza shop, but to partner with them? Right? And these are the things that for me will drive real sustainable development from a national agenda point of view. And if we just look then at from a public sector point of view, I think if we get the thing around project preparation, infrastructure can play a very material role in turning around construction sector, which has seen 9 consecutive quarters of negative growth. That could be an interesting value creator. But I think there's an interesting commodity cycle that's happening in agriculture that we're not looking at, which is particularly in horticulture and deciduous fruits, right? We're the second largest exporter of citrus. I think at the end of last year, we exported about 146 million boxes or cartons of citrus. Those are the new commodities for South Africa. They are high value commodities. Some of our avocados coming from South Africa are sold in London at £5 per avocado. Macadamia nuts, we're 1 or 2 depending on each season that you're looking at. And so there is an interesting commodity cycle happening in the agri space that is high value agri, that also we have a revealed comparative advantage in a global context. And if we invest in those subsectors, I think we can realize quite a bit of growth. And I think for me, those are the real opportunity sets for South Africa. It is a story of mixed opportunities where there are going to be negative outcomes for some sectors. But I think there are opportunities as well in the economy, depending on where we choose to channel our investment.
Yep. Okay. Zama and I'd like to give you guys the final words on today's budget and where this conversation has veered, where it has veered to.
Well, just for starters, FISA did not bring me down. I'm still happy that I'm paying R1 less in tax. Okay. So very excited. I've been looking forward to it for the last 6 months. I think one thing that I wish he touched more on is just the financial sector reform, which is quite key, and creating South Africa as the financial hub of South Africa, because it also leads into the what Fis was saying, but leveraging off of South Africa, the assets that we have. And I think if he can prioritize that and make sure that the regulation around there, and because ultimately, I mean, even if we've got access as a good asset there, we need to have that flow and attraction to South Africa as a financial hub. So I'm hoping that there was no word on it, and not much word on it in the budget. But I'm hoping that it's not something that's not on the agenda and that it's going to be prioritized. But otherwise, let's just hold our breaths for 6 more months and then see if any more luck or more bad luck happens. That's all for me.
Zama?
I spend my day in the fintech sector, right? And I work in a Pan-African company. And when you're outside of South Africa, in fintech, South Africa is a has-been. No one is excited about South Africa. I mean, South Africa is one of those countries you have to go in because still a large market, still a lot of people, still deep pockets, but no one's that excited about South Africa. And so I think we really need, outside of just the budget, in terms of economic policy thinking, which I think has been lacking in South Africa for a while, we really need to look in the mirror and see that we're actually starting to miss out in the continent. We're starting to not become a thing. There's no gateway. People are able to fly directly to wherever they want to go. They invest directly where they want to invest. And a lot of South African companies have not been doing well on the continent. And so we actually really need to get back to deep thinking about the economy of the future, the South African economy of the future, and not look back and see little spikes in mining and get all excited. What economies what sectors are we going to be strong in the next 10 years? And what can we do now? What kind of interventions can we do now? What kind of investments can we do now? What kind of capacities do we need to build now? And I think that is not a treasury conversation, and we've kind of treated treasury as though it is a policy
think tank
spearheader, and it's not a think tank.
No, it shouldn't be. No, it's CFO. Yeah.
Exactly. The CFO is not your strategist. And we need to be actually speaking more and expecting more out of the economic cluster as a whole, and more out of our thought leaders. I actually have found that the conversations in South Africa have degenerated to memes of arguments rather than substantive arguments about the future. We're arguing about things we were arguing about 8-10 years ago. We all need to move and start reimagining what this economy needs to look like in order to be able to absorb the bulk of the skill that's in the country. And we also need to treat young people as though they are trainable, they are capable, and not simply say if your matric result is X, that's a write-off. If you only did maths lit, you're a write-off. That kind of write-off conversation about our current skill is part of what actually holds us back. There are a lot of potential industries, particularly in the tech space, that don't require somebody to have a complex engineering degree, that actually provide high quality employment. So we really need to think outside this current conversation that we've been having.
That just reminds me about that as we close off. Is there still a Department of Economic Planning? Is it still there in this new administration? Is it, I've totally forgot that we have economic planning, DTI, and all these other ministries that almost we forget about, and everyone sits on treasury, which is, as you say, it's just our CFOs. Maybe they shouldn't be planning our future, laying out our economic future, but it is what it is. But thank you so much, guys, for joining us. That's Zaman Ndlovu, Fin24 columnist, Nolwandle Mthombeni, analyst at Intellidex, and Sfiso Kenjani, chief economist at IQ Business. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Good evening.